So the main motives of the KKK were to maintain white supremacy, destroy the Republican Party, and create a political rise of the racist South. And the KKK also influenced many southern states to disenfranchise Black people by the literacy tests, which were requirements that if you to be eligible to vote, you need to be able to read and write. And this specifically targeted Black people because Black people did not have the widespread opportunity towards education, unlike whites did. And not only did the KKK do this, but they also committed voter fraud to prevent Black votes from counting, and they murdered Black people. It's estimated that between 1865 to 1900s, the KKK committed 3,500 lynchings of Black people in America, and they also terrorized Black churches and schools. And not only were Black people victims of this terrorism, but also Republicans. They were commonly known as carpetbaggers and scalawags, and carpetbaggers described Northerners who moved to the South after the Civil War and were Republicans, and scalawags referred to Southerners who supported Republicans in Congress and their policies. And so this clearly shows how, although Black people did start to receive legal rights, they were still facing grave discrimination and terror for this race. And this will be reflected later on in the Jim Crow era. So, moving along to a little bit towards the women's rights and women's perspective of this time and the passing of the 14, 15, 13, 14, and 15 amendments, it was disappointing at a level for women's rights advocates because they were actively involved in this fight. They were actively involved in the fight for Black suffrage, and seeing their suffrage being disregarded, um, activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who they campaigned against the 14th Amendment because of its inability to include women. Um, and so generally, like, the women's rights movement during this time was not very strong. It was not at its strongest because it was overshadowed by the efforts of the Black movement during this time, but it would slowly come in later on after several years. So going back to the relations between the Republicans of Congress and President Johnson, the tensions intensified after Johnson broke the Tenure of Office Act in 1867. And so this was passed by Congress to limit Johnson's powers by restricting the ability uh, for the president to remove officials without the consent of Congress. So the president cannot fire or remove any of his cabinet members without the consent of Congress. And so Johnson broke this act by removing Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton from office because he was a former member of Lincoln's administration, and as Johnson finds out that he was a secret supporter of the Radicals, and Johnson wanted to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant, but the Supreme Court refused to grant this because of the legal violation that it held. So he could not further approach this, and Congress took this opportunity to impeach Johnson. However, during this time, no further action was able to be passed. So later on, in 1868, when Johnson again violated this act, he was firing Stanton once again and appointing a different person, General Thomas, into the secretary. And in response to this, Congress drafted 11 articles of impeachment against Johnson. And these articles were taken into Senate, where the impeachment trial was being placed. And however, the impeachment was not able to be carried out successfully, even though they had votes on the 3 of the 11 articles and several other votings. They failed to meet the two-third majority vote. In 1877, there was a compromise, the Compromise of 1877, which basically marked the end of the Reconstruction. And so there was an election between Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden and Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes. And Samuel had a more popular vote, but there were disputes of the electoral votes for almost 4 months in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. And so, to advocate for his campaign, Rutherford promised white Southerners that he would stop the military occupation of the South, which was specifically in Louisiana and South Carolina, where there were federal troops. This also relates to the Military Reconstruction Act, previously mentioned. And in return for this, and also he agreed that he would stay out of Southern local affairs. In return for this, he wanted their vote. And this statement of staying away from Southern local affairs, it would later cause the Jim Crow laws to spread and start to rip away the rights and liberties of Black people in America. And so, because of this freedom being given to the South after the control by radical Republicans in Congress, the South agreed and Hayes was granted the presidency, effectively ending um, the Reconstruction. And so, when we reflect on the Reconstruction was a time period in America's history that can be interpreted to some as a success and to others as a failure. And it's truly important to note the different sides to each of these events mentioned and that were mentioned in this time period. And it indeed was a time that marks the aftermath of a victory for the Union and the ratification of the symbolic 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But it was also flooded with different political and social and economical hardships that would forever change the face of Black people in America as it walks into the Jim Crow era. That's it for the Reconstruction, and make sure you follow Vox Media and stay tuned for more topics.